What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about a new release for Warhammer 40,000. The datasheet for Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, has finally been fully revealed by Warhammer community. So let's talk a little bit about him and what he does. And as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content and coverage, then go ahead and drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube stuff, and let's talk about Lionel Johnson a little bit. Now, we talked about a lot of the Lions mechanics in a previous video when they were first spoiled by Games Workshop, but what I'm going to give you now is a holistic view of the entire datasheet now that we have it, and some of my thoughts about where he fits into the Dark Angels faction as a whole. To be fair as well, he can also be taken in other factions, given that he is a Primarch and currently in the Arcs of Omen format, he can be taken alongside any Space Marine chapter. That said, he has no real synergy with any other Space Marine chapters, and I think you're almost entirely going to be putting him into a Dark Angels build. So as a little bit of a quick recap, I'm going to skip over a lot of the parts of the Lions datasheet that we've already seen. You can go look at my other video if you want me to hear me talk about those. But as a summary, he has an impressive stat block, a Primarch level stat line at Strength 6, Toughness 6, with an 8-inch move, 2+ weapon skill, and ballistic skill, a massive 10 attacks that will stack alongside Shock Assault, as well as some solid defensive stats, including a 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable save from the Emperor's Shield. Now, interestingly, the Emperor's Shield is not quite as good as a Storm Shield for whatever reason. A regular Storm Shield is a little bit more effective at protecting its wearer. It does reflect mortal wounds in melee, but it doesn't do anything to his armor save. So unlike a Terminator with a Storm Shield, which will be on a 1+ armor save and effectively get to ignore the first point of AP that the attacker has, Lionel Johnson doesn't do that. That means that even AP 1 weapons are going to have an impact on this guy, and they're going to dent him pretty hard. So while high AP weapons will probably bounce off the invulnerable save, low AP weapons are actually pretty efficient against him. Now, thanks to Forest Walk, Lionel Johnson also doesn't have to be foot-stocking off the table. He can deep strike onto the table, although with some of his other support abilities, you will most likely want to keep him near the bulk of your army. Now, he does have his powerful melee attack, either a strength 10, AP 5, 4 damage, swing with 11 attacks, or he can double those to be strength 6, AP 3, 2 damage to clear lighter infantry. Now, what we didn't see is his pistol, the Arma Luminous, which is apparently, I guess, a combi pistol. And this might be a new templating we see for combi weapons. You can select one or both of the profiles to make attacks with every time you shoot with it, but there's no penalty to hit involved. You can shoot both the Bolt Shot, which is 2 shots at strength 4, AP 1, 2 damage, and the Plasma Shot, which is strength 8, AP 4, 2 damage. Not the greatest range profile in the game, but certainly not too bad. He does certainly wish he had Gilliman's impressive long-range damage output, though, I'm sure. Now, Johnson also has 2 Watchers in the Dark on his base, and those are being reflected in the Watchers in the Dark ability. Up to twice per battle, he can deny the Witch as if he were a Psyker. He can reroll against Chaos Psykers, which is a little bit of a flavor addition there. I also have the list taking Ezekiel. Dark Angels don't often take too many Psykers, so a lot of their psychic defense comes from Watchers in the Dark or the Watched Warlord trait, and Lionel Johnson adding 2 of those to your army certainly helps. And that goes doubly so since he probably takes the place of at least one Deathwing Terminator squad that would normally be having a Watcher in the Dark. He fights first in combat thanks to Martial Exemplar, and this combos perfectly with his Warlord trait, which is a unique Warlord trait no other model in the game can have. He does have to be your Warlord if he's included in your army, but you don't have to buy the Warlord trait. You could leave it at home for a CP if you want, but if you bring it in your opponent's movement phase, you can select one friendly Dark Angels unit within 9 of Lionel Johnson. This can include Lionel Johnson himself. He is a friendly unit within 9 of himself. Until the end of the turn, that unit is eligible to perform heroic interventions as if it were a character, and eligible to perform a heroic intervention if it is within 6 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically of an enemy unit. So this is an extended heroic intervention, and you can choose who you do it on. However, there's a little bit of counterplay. It does choose in the movement phase, which means your opponent then has the shooting phase and charge phase to select. It is a little bit of a gotcha ability, given that it is in the movement phase, not at the start or end of the movement phase, meaning that you can hold it until you see all relevant enemy movements have occurred. Then you choose who you're going to heroically intervene with, which is pretty odd, but gives it a very powerful timing slot. Now, if Lionel Johnson does that himself, he gets eligible for a 6-inch heroic intervention. You have to remember to declare it, obviously, but if you do, once he gets into melee with that 6-inch move, he is then going to fight first. So it's essentially a charge for him. He's going to be going simultaneous with whatever units in your opponent's army is charging that turn, meaning that they'll select a charging unit, then you will be able to fight with Lionel Johnson. And with his insane damage output, as we talked about in the last video, he can kill almost anything in the game. He's certainly 1 rounds a night. Now, that was unsure of whether or not he had any reroll abilities, and he for sure does, because he also has the Primarch of the First Legion aura. This gives core or character units within 6 inches of Lionel Johnson reroll 1s to hit and wound. This affects Lionel Johnson himself, given that he is a Dark Angels character within 6 inches of himself, but he can also affect other powerful character units. Things like Talon Masters getting reroll 1s to wound auras is super powerful. Whether or not Lionel Johnson's going to see play is going to be an open question. He doesn't take up an HQ slot in an Arcs of Omen detachment, given that he's a Lord of War, which is huge for him. It means that he doesn't fight with your captains or other characters you would be taking in Dark Angels, but he does come in at a pretty penny of 320 points. Now, he fits a role in a Dark Angels list that's very powerful. He can sit inside your Terminator blocks. These units are incredibly hard to kill, some of the hardest to kill units in the game, but they are slow. And what Lionel Johnson can do for them is project out their threat using that Heroic Intervention aura on your opponent's turn. What this guy absolutely wants to do is be broadcasting a reroll aura in the center of the table, be surrounded by Dark Angels Terminators, and tell your opponent that if they move up to engage those Terminators, you will heroically intervene and kill them. Now, that sounds really powerful, but it's important to note that heroic interventions are some of the easiest mechanics in the game to get around. Because models have to go towards the closest enemy model, there are a lot of situations with heroic interventions where you can force them to heroically intervene into a unit that they don't necessarily want to. They also don't automatically get to activate in the fight phase if you then pull out of melee with them, meaning that there's a lot of things you can do to blank heroic interventions after they move. If you're right at the edge of an opponent's engagement range and then use pile-in and consolidate moves to leave the engagement range of the heroically intervening unit, they will not be able to attack you, even though they basically pseudo-charged. They didn't actually charge, so they don't get the automatic activation. If you put multiple models next to each other, you can also blank heroic interventions by engaging one unit during the heroic intervention step with a charge, preventing it from being able to declare a heroic intervention, and then using pile-in consolidate moves to move out of melee with it, meaning it just stays there entirely. Now, that said, it's much easier to stop a 3-inch heroic intervention than it is a 6-inch heroic intervention. It is nice that it forces the Dark Angels player to tell their opponent who is going to be intervening, because it then gives them that little bit of counterplay, but you can also play around it, especially since Dark Angel armies won't have a high model count. Now, I think that this ability is really cool and combos very well with the Dark Angels list, and I think especially, like I mentioned before, his ability to affect powerful character units like Talon Masters with his reroll of auras is going to be enormous. The downside I see, though, is that he's kind of just falling into the same trap that a lot of Dark Angels lists do. He wants to play these big Terminator bricks, but the Terminator bricks are not the most powerful part of a Dark Angels army. They're certainly the most resilient part, and they're the part that's going to be protecting him with Lookout Sir, but the actual damage is being dealt by those Talon Masters, by attack bike squads, and in some cases by units like Ravenwing Black Knights. So while he wants to be holding down the center of the table, any army that could already beat Dark Angels by fighting over the center of the table is just going to have to deal with 320 points of less Dark Angels, because you have Lionel Johnson in your army, and he himself, while he hits like an absolute truck, is most likely going to kill anything that 10 Dark Angels Terminators could kill. I mean, certainly he's a little bit more consistent at it. Dark Angels Terminators sometimes just whiff on things, and Lionel Johnson's not going to do that quite as often, but I don't know if you need that extra damage output. Once your opponent's up close and personal with a Dark Angels army, they're most likely going to die anyway. So why do we need a 320-point beat stick? The 320-point price level is probably a little bit too much for this guy, because he doesn't do very much outside of melee. While he's moving up the table or holding for his opponent to charge into him and activate his heroic intervention abilities, he has a really mediocre gun and a reroll aura, both of which are good, but neither of which are really worth 320 points. He has to get into melee at some point in the game to make his points back. If you don't, he's not really doing anything. A little bit of an interesting one. I was kind of hoping Lionel Johnson would have a little bit more force multiplication ability. A lot of the power that we just talked about is tied up in his Warlord trait as well, which means he steals the Warlord slot from Azrael, who is refunding you command points for being your Warlord, and he also then costs you a CP to buy that Warlord trait. So in the comparison with Azrael, he was also going to cost you basically 3 additional command points, which is kind of a lot. Although, to be fair, not taking Azrael does open up your captain slot to take Samael or Lazarus. Both are super powerful captains in the Dark Angels faction. So, you know, maybe it's not all bad. As we've seen with recent releases like Angron, the ability of a character to be a huge beatstick and kill anything it wants to in the game in melee is not actually that powerful. And even with Angron being a huge model with an enormously fast speed, he himself is not even actually that good. And Lionel Johnson, while he does have more force multiplication effects, is much slower and does not have the fly keyword. He's also monster keyworded, so he's going to have a tough time going through buildings. He just fights over the center objective in a lot of missions. And so really, I'm not sure he's that much better than Azrael, all things considered, but he does hit much harder and he's a cooler model. Whether or not he's more competitive, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. So let me know down in the comments what you think about Lionel Johnson and his full data sheet. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are awesome and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.